Today we're making a cozy sweater with an optional touch of class using knitted fabric. This is New Look 6142, a his-her pattern with patch pockets sewn on the inside for a seamless exterior. There's also a hood with a flat felled back seam and a neckline seam binding. We'll also be installing a separating zipper, and I'll show how I've shortened mine to fit the center front. Make this sweater in any stable knit from a medium weight jersey, ponte, sweatshirting, or even a sherpa. So many options to make it a piece you'll reach for often. Let's get started. Here is one of my front bodice pieces, and I've gone ahead and marked the pocket openings here with pins. We're going to stay stitch with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, starting just outside the dot transferred from your pattern piece, all the way down past the lower dot transferred from the pattern piece. Then at both of our dot markings, we're going to clip to the stay stitching. I'll turn this piece over to the wrong side. And for the section that we clipped into, we're going to press it to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch. I'm also going to be adding knit stay tape to stabilize this section. Just pressing it in place along that seam allowance. Then I'll press the section back by 5/8. If you like, you can add a few pins. Then we're going to edge stitch slightly along that horizontal edge, pivot and top stitch with a 3/8 inch seam allowance along the folded edge, pivoting once again to edge stitch along the short end on the opposite side. Along the right side of the pocket, I'm going to be applying knit stay tape to the lower bottom edge and curved edge of the pocket. Then I'll place this right side of the pocket onto the wrong side of the front bodice. Align your dots and pin in place, also pinning along the curved and bottom edges. We're going to baste the pocket in place along those outer edges. Then we'll sew the inner curved and bottom edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. For my back piece, I've gone ahead and stabilized the shoulder seams just as I stabilized the edges earlier. And I'm going to place the two front pieces right sides together with this back piece and pin in place along the shoulder seams. I've also stabilized those front shoulders as well. Sew the shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Here are my front and back pieces opened out away from each other at the shoulder seam. I'll place the corresponding sleeve at the arm side right sides together and pin in place, aligning your dots and notches. We're going to sew the sleeve in place with two sets of stitches, first sewing with a 5/8 inch seam allowance to attach, then sewing once more with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Repeat to attach both sleeves. I'm going to trim the seam allowances on both sides below the outer notches, just trimming right below that second set of stitches. This will reduce some of the bulk at the underarm seam. Repeat for both sleeves. Place your front and back pieces right sides together as well as their sleeves. And pin the side seams and the underarm seams. Repeating on both sides. Then we'll sew these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance from the bottom of the sleeve across the underarm seam to the bottom of the jacket. As you're sewing around the pocket opening, stitch carefully so that you don't sew the pocket shut. The hem allowance for the bottoms of the sleeves is 1.5 inches. I'm going to do a slightly deeper hem of 2.5 inches, folding the raw edge to the wrong side and pinning in place. Repeat to pin both sleeves. The hem allowance along the very bottom of the jacket is also 1.5 inches. Since I've shortened the jacket, I'm choosing to sew a hem of 1 inch. and I'll pin in place all the way across. I'm going to sew each of the hems in place along the bottom of the jacket and the bottoms of both sleeves. First, I'll stitch about 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge, then I'll stitch once more about 1/4 of an inch below that stitching. For the separating zipper, I want the bottom zipper stop to be about 1/4 of an inch away from the bottom edge of the garment, and I want the top zipper stop to be 3/4 of an inch away from the top edge. So I'm going to mark where I'm going to be shortening the zipper. Then I'll open up the zipper, cut off the excess zipper tape leaving a seam allowance, and remove the teeth within the seam allowance. Doing that on both sides of the zipper tape. Using a needle and thread, I'll sew a new stop at the top of the zipper tape at the 3/4 inch marking. Doing that on both sides. For each of my center fronts, I've applied my knit stay tape to the center edges. Then I'll separate my zipper and place one side of the zipper tape right sides together with its corresponding center front edge. I'll pin it in place so that the zipper teeth are 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge. My bottom stop is once again 1/4 inch from the bottom edge, and my top zipper stop is 3/4 of an inch away from the top raw edge. Repeat for the opposite center front. At the top edges of each zipper tape, you can fold back that tape material so that it tapers in right at the dot transferred from the pattern piece. Repeating on both sides. Sew each tape in place. Now that both of our zipper tapes are sewn in place, we're going to flip them to the inside so that just the teeth are exposed on the outside of the garment. Pin in place from top to bottom. Top stitch from top to bottom along each center front edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Here are my 2 hoodie pieces, and I've gone ahead and applied strips of interfacing to where the buttonholes will be sewn. I've also marked my buttonhole placement, transferring it from the pattern piece. Now I'll sew the buttonholes in place. Then open up your buttonholes. Place your 2 hoodie pieces right sides together and pin the center back seam. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. To create a nice clean center back seam on the inside, we're going to trim one side of the seam allowance only to 1/4 of an inch. Then we'll open out this seam and press the full side of the seam allowance over the side that we trimmed. Pin from the outside. Now that I have that center back seam pinned on the outside, catching that full layer of the seam allowance on the inside, we'll top stitch along that center back seam with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, catching that full seam allowance on the inside. Along the outer edges of the hoodie, you're going to press those edges to the wrong side by 1 1/4 inches. all the way from the bottom raw edge, around the top, to the opposite bottom raw edge. I've pinned those pressed edges to the inside. Now we'll top stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Trim the excess fabric on the inside beyond your stitching. Place the bottom raw edge of your hood right sides together with the top raw edge of the neckline and pin in place all the way around, matching your notches and dots. Baste the hood in place from one center front to the other. We're going to be using 3/4 inch wide twill tape to cover the seam allowance along the neckline. I'm going to place the twill tape on top of the neckline so that one edge of the twill tape sits 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge of the seam allowance. You also want a 1/2 inch of twill tape to extend beyond both of the center fronts. Sew that neckline once again, this time with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, catching that twill tape in your stitches. Now I'm going to trim that seam allowance about even with that inner edge of the twill tape. Now we're going to turn that twill tape over the seam allowance. On each outer edge of the center front where we have twill tape extending, fold it back. Fold that twill tape downward. Pin in place. Now that I have my twill tape pinned in place on the inside, I'm going to edge stitch close to the bottom edge of the twill tape. Lace your cording through the hoodie through the buttonholes. And your hoodie zip-up jacket is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.